The Pentagon recently declassified some UFO footage and some testimony from US Navy pilots. And one of the things that has inspired is a actual conversation in public that isn't just a bunch of wackadoodles. There have definitely been all kinds of interesting UFO sightings for many, many years now. If you're interested in kind of getting a history of that, there's a great documentary on Amazon called The Phenomenon. I'm not here to convince anybody about whether there's aliens or extraterrestrials, but one of the things this declassification has done is brought the conversation about UFOs. What are these? What would it mean to interact with an extraterrestrial race or a higher intelligence potentially into intellectual circles? I've seen several people engaging with Lex Friedman on this topic. There's definitely been talk on podcasts around the world about, the idea of aliens. And it's interesting that it is becoming something mainstream. I mean, if you look on any news channel, local or national, they have covered the declassification and shown the footage of these unidentified flying objects that no government knows or has an idea of how it could exist, who is creating the technology, and more importantly, how is it possible within our current framework of physics and science. If you're interested in seeing some of that footage, just search Pentagon UFO on YouTube and you can find some of that. But I wanted to give my take on what these ships like the Tic Tac, which is what they're calling it, are. And in order to do that, I kind of have to map out somewhat the framework of reality that I'm experimenting with as kind of how things work. And then I can talk about how these UFOs exist within that framework of reality. So a lot of my thinking is based on hundreds of hours of content and reading from people like Tom Campbell, AJ Miller, Darryl Anka, Esther Hicks. These are all people that have had some kind of extrasensory connection with an intelligence outside of themselves, or at least this is what they claim. And there's a lot of interesting information about UFOs, about other dimensions, about the nature of reality that have come through those conversations and channelings. And so my own thinking as an amalgamation of being heavily steeped in some of that information. And so the premise that I'm working from is that reality is some kind of an electromagnetic information field, and it exists on a spectrum of frequency. And that frequency has been named by us psychologically as fear being on one end and love being on the other. And our emotional state dictates how we see or perceive the information field that we're able to see and experience as our life, as reality. And so emotions are just electromagnetic fields that are helping us perceive reality and in many ways creating a filter on what we can and can't see. In many ways, reality is like a video game environment. It doesn't all exist all at once. Just like in a video game, it would take too much processing power to have the video game rendering the entire world of the video game at every moment of the game. The game only renders what's immediately perceivable to you and the things that you're engaging with. And in many ways, I think that at a much higher frame rate, reality is somewhat of an environment like that where we're only rendering what we perceive. And so if this is some kind of a simulation, so to speak, that maybe is housed in consciousness or in some kind of a sentient electromagnetic field, then outer space is really more like a hyperspace. Instead of there being extraterrestrials, they're more like interterrestrials. So they're kind of like the beings that people see when they're on DMT or when they're taking psychedelics. These are beings potentially just like we're beings, but while we're experiencing a lower level frequency that exists in a very dense energy, and so that's why there's a physicality to what we're doing, I think that there are other dimensions that are lighter in frequency and exist more in an electromagnetic plane. So if reality is more like a simulation that we're interacting with, then outer space is really more like what psychonauts have called hyperspace. It's a dimensional field that we can engage with, and extraterrestrials would really be more like interterrestrials. They're information that we can engage with. And so people who are on DMT or psychonauts or having an extrasensory or extra dimensional experience on mushrooms or something like ketamine, they're engaging with this hyperspace world or these interdimensional beings. My sense is that outer space is really just kind of this representative idea of an infinite spectrum of dimensional spaces or experience. And it's kind of like a menu in a video game where you're looking at the map of what's possible, and then you can kind of direct your attention in the game towards whatever you want. And so outer space is an information idea designed to help us grapple with the idea of infinity, and maybe hang a carrot that says, hey, there's always more to know, there's always more to explore, to instill a sense of wonder in us, perhaps. And so we as a consciousness or a spirit are an intelligence that is moving through this simulation or this dimensional space in both an electromagnetic vehicle, and then in lower densities that solidifies as like a physical tangible vehicle, or the meat suit that we're currently in. And the sense that I get is that these dimensions are operating kind of like channels on a television. And so on a spectrum of fear to love, each of these channels exists, and you can only engage with certain channels based on the frequency that you're holding as your emotional state, which of course then in our current density manifests as a biochemical state. And right now, I think that Earth has a collective frequency that is shifting from fear to deeper levels of love. And so, what we're experiencing and seeing with our five senses is just the reality that is rendered for us as a collective. It is a match to our emotional state, our belief systems, which is part of that electromagnetic field, and our collective agreement of what we want to experience. And that collective agreement is, for the most part, I think, unconscious to us as society. And so then there's also 99.99999 whatever it is percent of the universe that is unrendered in our experience. And I think that there is all kinds of information in that 99.9999% of unrendered information or untapped potential that sits as information that's mapped on top of our reality, but we're not able to perceive it because it's outside of the frequency band that we're currently tuned to. And so our beliefs, and more importantly, how we feel about what we believe, is kind of like a remote control that allows us to perceive different information or electromagnetic fields. And so, depending on how open or closed minded we are, we can actually tune ourselves to experience anomaly. And so a UFO would be a kind of anomaly within the collective agreement. Not everybody has agreed that they want to, expand into this deeper level of exploration of the universe or hyperspace or the simulation or whatever it is. But enough people are open-minded about it that little Easter eggs are being dropped in, and it's basically a choose your own adventure novel where you can look at that Easter egg and you can see the news story about the UFOs that the Pentagon and the Navy have disclosed, and you get to decide, do you want to be in a reality that tunnels into that a little bit deeper, or are you going to ignore it? And then I think based on what our unconscious belief systems are, determine whether or not we'll move into a collective that experiences a deeper unpacking of concepts like UFOs or not. And so as we look at outer space and we see people like Elon Musk and Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, the billionaire club going to light space, my sense is that that's going to look pretty archaic, potentially in our lifetime, because using fuel and fire to propel us through an information-based reality is just inefficient. I think that we'll likely discover that there are ways of embedding objects with an electromagnetic frequency that allows us to just kind of teleport or jump to new frequency bands of the universe, and that there's probably a electromagnetic relationship between location in the simulation that we can easily jump to. And so where I'm getting to is I'm trying to set up the framework for how some of the, I think one of the US Navy pilots who saw the Tic Tac UFO said that it moved unlike anything it had seen before, or any technology that he knew of that might be in existence based on our current physics. And so the reason that they can move that way is because they're operating with a higher science that's based on electromagnetic frequency, rather than rocket propulsion. And if we understand that bandwidth of electromagnetic frequency as a spectrum of fear to love, then fear would be a really dense physical manifestation of that band, and love is going to be a lighter, more coherent frequency. And love could be passion, excitement, creativity, joy. There's many flavors of love that represent this other side of the spectrum. Fear and love are like oil and water. They can't really mix. And so when we are, as a society, are living in fear or hatred or rage, then that's incongruent with a reality of love. And so these people that are in this fear, rage, resentment, it's difficult for them to grasp or see or perceive anything that's existing in a higher frequency. And so this often shows up as cynicism or skepticism. Of course, you can be a loving skeptic. I'm not saying that you can't. I'm just saying that it might close you off to certain ideas that would be otherwise available to you. And because we have an electromagnetic frequency of belief that is subject dependent, right? We can be really loving on one subject or towards one people and be resentful and hateful towards something else. So it's nuanced in how it shows up. But what I think, as part of the evolutionary nature and intelligent design of reality or the universe or the simulation that we're in, the consciousness device that we're using to articulate who we are and put order to chaos, it is, I think that the simulation and part of the planetary systems, which is just an information representation of what's happening at the frequency level, the electromagnetics of the planet are shifting and of the universe are shifting. And that shift pushes our experience closer to a bandwidth frequency of love and further away from fear. So if I'm a fearful person and I'm on Spaceship Earth, and Spaceship Earth is a representation of society moving from fear into love, well, what happens is if I'm full of hatred and resentment and rage, as we move more and more into lighter, higher frequencies of love, the fear inside of me can't exist at that new frequency. It's a mismatch. The electromagnetics of it can't exist. And so what happens is the electromagnetics of fear start to spin itself out, and that energy is burning itself off so that the density can drop and I can actually continue to accelerate into the higher frequencies without dying, without the vehicle that I'm in, both the spiritual vehicle and the physical vehicle that I'm in, dying. So all of that spinning of fear burning itself off temporarily looks like mania and chaos. And so have you seen any of that lately? You turn on the news and you're seeing a representation of what it looks like for fear to be spinning out its manic energy so that we can collectively move into higher frequencies. As we lose dense energy and we become less rooted as a society and individually in fear and more rooted in love, then anything that wasn't a match to love, or anything that is not a match to love, so starts to fade away. So those are ideas, concepts, old paradigms. That's what we're seeing, and is this kind of reorganization of society. And so the temporary chaos is like the crumbling of the old frequency so that the new frequency can be birthed. And in that birthing, there are certain markers that begin to open us up to higher ideas that exist in the new frequency. And so I think that UFOs are a representation or a marker that we're moving into these higher frequencies at a more accelerated rate. And as we do that, we become vibrationally or electromagnetically more capable of handling new ideas, new technologies, new science without weaponizing it. So I think these entities and these UFOs, whatever they are, have always been here. I think they've always had a reality that was congruent with ours. However, it was outside the energy bandwidth that we were currently partaking in as a society. And so only people that were of a higher, lighter, more open-minded on that particular subjects had experience. And those experiences, the UFO sightings that we started seeing in the 40s and 50s, were all designed to slowly seed the consciousness of humanity with these higher vibrational ideas. And the last half century has been a buildup to some of the breakthroughs that now seeing at this new bandwidth of frequency is going to allow us to experience. So just to recap, these UFOs, some are physical in nature, but some are just more electromagnetic in nature. They understand how to use their consciousness and intention to create a vehicle that allows them to traverse the simulation or the information field that we call reality or the universe. And one of the reasons that these entities haven't engaged with us in a deeper, more meaningful level yet is that we're still so much in the frequency of fear that even engaging with them would open our consciousness up to new ideas, new technology that is life-giving technology. However, when viewed through a lens of fear, it could easily be weaponized. And so right now, we are in the unfortunate situation where humanity tends to weaponize its technology. And until we move out of that mindset and that belief system and that electromagnetic frequency that's birthed in fear or protectionism, we're not going to be able to engage with these higher dimensional beings at a societal level. Although I do think at an individual level, more and more, there's going to be an opportunity to have that interaction. And that many of the new technologies that come about, whether we consciously recognize that they were seeded from some inner terrestrial that was giving us the idea, or whether we just receive it as a kind of intuition, I think that all inventors, all scientists are tapped into this kind of collective consciousness field. And many of those ideas do get seeded from these interdimensional entities who are looking to guide us towards greater levels of love. So how long will it take before we are collectively as a society in a place where we won't weaponize higher consciousness technology? You know, TBD, to be determined. But this is obviously one interpretation of this model of reality, is that there is an intelligent design to the universe, and this frequency band of fear to love and the ideas that are available depending on where you show up on that frequency band is designed basically to not destroy the simulation, right? As we weaponize energy through things like nuclear weapons, it becomes more and more likely that we end up destroying not only the planet, and ourselves, but potentially large portions of the universe or galaxy, or portions of the simulation, because it creates an electromagnetic distortion in the simulation. And so it's interesting as you watch documentaries like The Phenomenon on Amazon, which kind of unpacks all of the military sightings and involvement with UFOs we've had over the past 60 years. A lot of these UFOs show up over nuclear sites. They're disengaging warheads, and you could argue that their sole mission is to prevent us from ruining the simulation for everybody else. And so it's almost like there's interterrestrial or intergalactic or simulation checks and balances in place through this electromagnetic spectrum that exists of fear to love, that prevent us from destroying the entire galaxy and keep us on a trajectory of growth. So given all of that, what would it mean for us to engage or interact with a potentially higher form of advanced intelligence? And my sense is that on one hand, it would be great. One, it would be humbling, which I think that we desperately need as a human society, is to just be humbled a little bit so that we can get into our hearts a little bit more and out of the busy nature of mind chatter. It would also give us a greater awareness of how things actually work, assuming that they're traversing the universe or the simulation through these electromagnetic vehicles and potentially physical vehicles. There's obviously a higher level of understanding of science and how things actually work that we could learn from them. And so that opens up a whole new revolution of life-giving technologies that will open up greater health, wealth, and relationships, society-wise and galaxy-wise and simulation-wise. On the other hand, I think that it will be easy for us as humans to worship any entity that comes in, and for atheists to say that the science that they present is the God, and that the concept of something higher than the science is still non-existent. And one of the things that I feel has us stuck right now is this idea that there's some kind of finality to science, or that there's such thing as settled science. And I disagree with this. I think that everything should always be framed as a hypothesis, and maybe this is the best science that we have right now, but we should constantly be testing new information and new ideas against our current understanding in order to find the nuggets that live out on the bleeding edge. And I think some scientists are great at doing this, and many, especially those who have elevated voices through mainstream legacy media systems, are not good at leaving room for possibility, or even room that they may be wrong about everything that they know. And as a seeker, that's always been a mantra that I've tried to keep in the forefront of what I'm doing, is that I may be wrong about everything that I think I know. And so if that's the case, give me eyes to see what it is I'm missing, or what it is that is a higher truth. And that has served me well as a seeker. And I think that part of engaging with a higher intelligence is recognizing that any system is just, even if it works really well, and even if it's light years ahead of what we currently have, which likely this type of intelligence would be able to offer us, they may be light years ahead of us in their capacity to love. And that might be completely overwhelming for us to have someone view us from a framework that is so deeply embedded in a framework of love. I think that we've somewhat experienced that when somebody sits in front of a guru and has almost a psychedelic experience. It's the frequency of love overwhelming the frequency of fear, and that the energy of that fear and the density of that fear and the heaviness of that fear spinning itself out at such a rapid rate that it's overwhelming to our senses and our nervous system. And my sense is that that will to some extent be what it's like to engage with some of these entities, and that of course lends itself to guru worship. And I don't think that that is the right framework for consistent exploration of who we are as spiritual beings. And so while of course these entities will have a lot to teach us, just because they may be billions of years ahead in their evolution doesn't mean that there's not something that we can still contribute to, because we can learn from them, embody what they know, and then still be on the bleeding edge of things, seeking out where the next discovery lives. And my guess is that that lives in layers of love, our capacity to love at a deeper level, and therefore perceive more of the information bandwidth or bandwave. So the opportunity, I think, that a higher intelligence or a ship landing on the White House lawn, however it ends up happening, I think it'll be more subtle and nuanced than that, where individuals and small groups are probably seeded with experiences to the point where the general public recognizes that this is something that's happening regularly now. And then at some point, there will be a more global event that we all then have to collectively agree happened as truth in our current reality. But the opportunity from all of that will be to learn from these beings and beyond how to hold the frequency of love and creativity that they're modeling, and then to ask to be shown by God or a higher intelligence or whatever is guiding this reality, asked to be shown for even greater levels of loving capacity and the information and the experience that comes with those greater levels of love. Because my sense is that these entities, because we're starting to perceive them with our physical senses, are really not that much more far removed from where we are. If we can see them, then they're just on the outer periphery of our current bandwidth of perception. And my guess is that there are tons of civilizations or entities or dimensions or information fields that are far beyond who we'll be interacting with first at a physical level. And that this can be a stepping stone into engaging with those deeper levels of love. And that it would be a disservice to us to just assume that this one higher intelligence is the highest intelligence that's available, and then become subservient to it in some way. So in the future, I believe that the electromagnetic spectrum, the poles of which we call fear and love currently, are going to give us completely new access to experience, to perception, and to information that allows us to choose our own adventure in a completely new way. And so it's really exciting for me to think about how this allows us to take a huge quantum leap in what we believe as a society, and therefore what we are capable of holding at an emotional capacity level within ourselves. And I really do believe that those of us who align with love and creativity and passion and follow our excitement, we become a frequency that continues to move the spectrum or dimensional frequency of the simulation that we're in into higher and higher levels, which then, of course, spins out all of the unconscious fear energy so that we can all consciously or kicking and screaming move into higher levels of love. And for me, that's what things like the Tic Tac UFO and the physics that it represents and the curiosity that it sparks within us as a society is pointing to, is that we will recognize that there is a direct relationship with the level of fear or love that we have and the technology that we're able to engage. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think the UFOs that the Pentagon has declassified are, and how you're thinking about extraterrestrials, interterrestrials, hyperspace, outer space, or anything else. Leave it in the comments. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm John Ray with Awaken Entrepreneur, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.